well, Luther kicked it out. He thought many of the doctrines that the Catholic Church supported were alluded to in the Apocrypha, and he didn't want it. But however, in the early America, the Apocrypha was included in most Bibles. And in the 19th century, early 19th century, it was included in these Bibles. And even the Bible that Ellen White's family had, most family Bibles, they included the Apocrypha in the coffee table Bibles. And according to Dr. Cox, Ellen White referred to the Apocrypha frequently. And there was an article recently came out in Adventist Today about early Adventists using the Apocrypha. So it's been in and out of favor through the years. And as I was reading, or I say reading, listening to different videos on this, it seems like you're either for it or against it. And so we'll take a look at it. We're going to take a look at it over the next several weeks. I'm going to take, back up, we're using the book, now, excuse me here. Okay, Judaism Before Jesus, the events and ideas that shaped the New Testament. And it's authored by Anthony Tomasino, who is a United Methodist minister in Michigan. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago with a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilization. And he did go to Asbury Theological Seminary in Kentucky, where he specialized in biblical studies. And then Buddy went to another school down there in Ann Arbor. I can never say that school down there. So anyway, so he's got quite a pedigree, and we have found the book very interesting. And I'm just trying to think of a couple of the other things I want to say. One of the things that we don't often realize, that there were more Jews outside of Palestine than there were inside of Palestine, especially at the beginning of the first century. I understand, and someone could correct me on this, but Alexandria at one time had 1 million Jews in it, and they were Greek Jews. Anyway, so as I said, we'll look at the Septuagint at a later date. And so we're going to start a journey looking at the Apocrypha, and I'm going to start looking at it and try to put it in its historical context. And I've also got Rodney there on the side. Hang on, my wife's got something going. Okay. Rodney will be on the side to help as we go through this. I'd like to get through or up to at least the Persian period, but I'd like to start out with the historical context. So at this time, I'm going to share my screen, and I hope, okay. And see, now I've got to go down here. Okay. All right, we're going to look at, starting with Judah, which is what we're familiar with from the Old Testament, from 1000 BC to 582. Actually, the Jerusalem fell in 586. Actually, it had been attacked in, I think, 590 something, and several were taken to Babylon at that time. Assyria, it was an Assyrian vassal for several years after the northern kingdom declined or was destroyed. And then it became a Babylonian province in 539 to 332. And that's a period that well, I should say that actually starting about 586 is when we talk about the 70 year of captivity. And all the leading Jews were taken to Babylon, and there they, were held in captivity. It probably was more house arrest than anything else. They seemed to have a lot of freedom to do what they wanted. So it was a time of great flux, and we need to remember that Jerusalem was completely destroyed. And in those days, when your capital city was destroyed and your temple was burnt down, you had no standing among the nations. Your God was considered the weakest of all gods. And so we take a look at that period from about 586 to about 332, when the Persians took over. And what was important with the Persian takeover of Babylon was that the Persian Emperor Cyrus provided religious freedom to all peoples, and that included the Jews. And so the Jews were allowed to go back to what was Palestine. And we know about Zerubbabel, we know from Zechariah, we know from Malachi, and I think Haggai, that there was a lot of struggle getting the temple built, and finally Zerubbabel got the temple built. But the city was not completed, and for some reason or another, Zerubbabel dropped off the radar screen. I don't know if they had radar screens then, but he's just, all of a sudden, we don't hear about him. And so then a few years later, about 30 or 40 years later, Nehemiah came, and Nehemiah laid the foundation for the walls of Jerusalem. Again, if a city or a people were to be recognized, then they had to be have their city with a wall around it. And so the city was much smaller now. The temple was much smaller, but at least the Jews had the opportunity to start practicing their religious practices. And so I'm not sure how much I want to go into that period with building the temple and rebuilding the walls, because we know a lot about Nehemiah. But I'd like to mention about Ezra. Ezra probably was the second Moses, according to our author in our book, that he probably edited the Bible as the Old Testament as we have it today in its major forms. So that was a very important period of time that they were bringing the religious experience back to Israel or to Palestine, but they were always under the guidance of Persia. And so they're there in as I said, in Babylon for several years, and then Cyrus comes and they start to rebuild themselves. I just wanted to, let's see if I can. I got too far. Oops. Okay. I don't know, as I said, the Jews, it's a big transitional period. And that's when they actually quit being called Israelites and started to become Jews, or as we know it today. But their experience with the Babylonians and the experience with the Persians greatly influenced their new history. Okay, looking at my notes here. Okay, so what was happening? Well, let me just back up for a minute. I've got a little ahead of myself. I have always been curious, and I know others that I've talked to, where did a lot of the New Testament teachings come from? What about resurrection? What about demons? What about different aspects that that we take for granted in the New Testament, but we can't find in the Old Testament? And so it was during this period, which we call the silent period, which it shouldn't be called, because there were many, many books written. And we call those the Apocrypha, which I think probably it doesn't do justice to them, because Apocrypha means hidden. And really, they were well known during the intertestamental period. And so there was just a lot of these things that were developed in Judaism during the Second Temple period that lead us into the New Testament. So the question that many people have is, why don't we include those in our Bibles today? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it seems like you're either for it or against it, whether or not you accept the Bible, the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books. And they are included in all Catholic editions of the Bible and Orthodox tradition. Matter of fact, Eastern Orthodox Bibles have even more than the Roman Catholic version does. So, what's going on? What's going on in this period? The Jews have come back. They're greatly influenced by the Babylonians. They're greatly influenced by the Persians, thankful to the Persians. And so there are many of these books that were started to be written that we call the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books. I'll probably say Apocrypha because it's easier for me to say. And so I want to take a look at some of these books, not for any particular reason, but there's the letter of Jeremiah, which is a typical Hellenistic Jewish attack on idolatry, disguised as a letter from Jeremiah to the exiles in Babylon. It was written in Greek, but may have originally been written in Aramaic. Now you remember Jeremiah went to Egypt instead of Babylon, according to tradition. Then we have 1st and 2nd Esdras, and they offer a parallel account of the events recorded in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, with the addition of the debate of the three youths. 2nd Esdras is an extension by Christian writers of an original Jewish apocalyptic work, also known as the Apocalypse of Ezra. The book wrestles with the problem of God's goodness and justice in the face of evil. And that's a new topic that we've never had a look at before. Say that tongue in cheek. And then Tobit, it's a short story about a godly Hebrew named Tobit and his son Tobias of the northern captivity. Anyway, in Tobit, Tobias is engaged to a woman who had been engaged and actually been married 7 times before. And each evening after the wedding, before they can consummate their marriage, a demon comes and kills her husband, her new husband. And so Tobias wants to know how that not to happen to him. So they go to someone and they get a magic incantation. And Tobias uses that incantation and binds the demon. Now, what's interesting about that story, and whether or not you want to believe it or not, it's being historically accurate. In Mark 2, when Jesus casts out the demon there in the synagogue. He just speaks, and the demon is cast out. And the people are amazed. Well, why are they amazed? They might be thinking about this story in Tobit, whereas Tobias, the son, had to go get this magic to cast the demon out. So I guess they were able to handle the demon. They lived happily ever after. Another one is the wisdom of Solomon. And I know that there's a reference of this in one of the Gospels, and I can't remember which one. That's one of the things that I'll be looking for. Again, talking about Solomon. Sirach, and I think David is the one that mentioned this one to us. It's also called Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus. And through poetic verse, the author gives ethical teachings for a successful life in the widest sense, through fear of the Lord, observance of the law. Then there's Baruch, who was the amanuensis of Jeremiah. It's a brief work allegedly written by the secretary of Jeremiah. Most scholars believe it is a compilation of various authors. It emphasizes the righteousness and wisdom of God while implying that God is merciful and listens to the pleas of the penitent. And some other additions. And my screen at the top is blocking some of this, but there's the prayer of Azariah, the song of the three young men. This obviously a reference to Daniel's three friends, Meshach, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Our boys used to call them Meshach, Shadrach, and off to bed we go. So I always get that a little mixed up. Then there's Susanna, the story of a beautiful and virtuous wife of the wealthy Jew in Babylon. Bella and the dragon, that was written to ridicule idolatry. The prayer of Manasseh, of course, the most evil king in Judah, according to the to the Bible. Now, you come down to 1st and 2nd Maccabees. These are historical books that cover Israel's history from 167 BCE to 100 BCE. They're named after Judas Maccabeus, who initiated the Jewish revolt in 166 BC against Rome. They're perhaps the most respected apocryphal books providing an historical account of Israel's struggles during the time between Malachi, the last book of the Jewish canon, and the time of Jesus Christ. The Maccabean victory over the Syrian ruler Antiochus Epiphanes forms a basis for the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights, commemorating the rededication of the temple after the Jews triumphed over the Syrians. By the way, this discussion, we'll continue that at some time in the future about Antiochus Epiphanes and the 2300-day prophecy, and how that even there was discussion in early Adventism about this issue. And then additions to the book of Esther, 6 additional passages expanding the original version of the book. I've mentioned some of these already here. Tobit, okay, sir, I got those. Okay. That's my slide presentation. I'm gonna, I want to make sure here if I forgot something.
You hit the last one.
Yeah, but I just didn't. Yeah. Anyway, my wife helped me with this.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to get out of this, and then I want to just go into some discussion now of what's going on. One of the things that Israel was very concerned about, or believed strongly, that the reason that they were sent into captivity was that as a nation, they were not faithful to Yahweh. And as you read much of the prophets, Jeremiah, they believed that because if they had been faithful to God, Yahweh, they would have not gone into captivity. But as a result of their idolatry, and as a result of their sin, Babylon took them into captivity. one of the things we need to remember too is that in the time before the captivity, people were not treated as individuals as much as they were collectively. And so the nation revolts against God. And by the way, the Israelites were not monotheists in the truest sense. They believed in many gods, maybe not as powerful as Yahweh, but there was a lot of, I'm going to say, well, we're going to cover all of our bases. Yahweh's good, but what about if I go to Beelzebub or somebody like that to cover will be okay. And so, they talk about the high places. They were doing pagan worship there. And of course, even the Jews were sacrificing to Moloch of their children. So they had gotten pretty wicked. And so they go into captivity. So now that they're back from captivity, they've learned their lesson. And we're going to see in later editions, later presentations, where these different schools of thinking, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, the Herodians, and others come into the New Testament. They didn't just drop in the first century, but they came as a result of this 400 years. And by the way, let me just make another side comment here. We think of 400 years, and then we go, well, it was quiet for 400 years. But do you stop a minute and think, what happened 400 years ago here in America? My ancestors came over on a boat. We're boat people, called the Mayflower. That's 400 years ago. There's been a few things that has happened since 1620. And then you think about 400 years before that, which would have been 1200. It was during the time of the Crusades. And it was a totally different, it was before gunpowder became into Europe. So I'm going to say 400 years is not just, 400 years. It was a long time. And you figure the average person lived maybe 40, 45 years. You're talking 10 generations now. And so it's a long time. And going back to my chart of all the different issues that, and you'll see this even more when we get into the Greek period, there was a lot of things going on, a lot of things historically. The Jews had to reevaluate themselves. The Jews had to take a look at what had happened and how they can avoid it again. So it was very, it's just like, I can't think of an equivalent thing here. It wouldn't be like the General Conference burning down, but it would be very dramatic for any groups that would lose its capital, lose its center of worship. We here in the West, we separate religion from our secular world in many ways. Maybe we shouldn't. But in the time time that we're talking about now, the cult, the worship, I don't use cult in a negative sense here, but rather the cult of Yahweh, the cult of your God was essential to your secular responsibilities. And so as Israel is coming back and Ezra is the second Moses, brings the law together, Ezra, I think, gets a little overboard at times, telling them all to get rid of their pagan wives, send them off, which in those days, it wasn't like they got alimony or anything like that. They were out up a creek without a paddle. But Israel was serious about coming back to Yahweh and to worshiping with him, worshiping him properly. Matter of fact, as I understand it, one of the sects were the Pharisees that came out of that. And of course, in Jesus' day, they were very rigid. But you think about it, they did not want to fall back into idolatry again. And so they actually maybe went too far the other way. So this time of coming back to Israel, to Palestine, to the Levant, was very critical to the Jews. But it also, remember, again, you've got Jews scattered all over the civilized world at this time. And Hebrew was going out of style. I don't think it was completely gone yet. It was still used in worship and used by scholars. By the way, even the Hebrew script changed at the time of the exile. And so when Ezra and others came back, they felt it important. And I personally believe this was the time that they spent a lot of time putting the Bible together that we know as the Old Testament, pulling parts from here and there and doing that. Theology was changing. Theology was changing. And I think this was probably one of the biggest things that was happening at this time, especially during the Persian period. And so I would like to take a look at some of that. But Rodney, did you have anything you wanted to say on this historical part? Thank you.
Forrest, you go ahead and finish your section on this, and I'll come back and pick up some perspectives and a little historical information. But you're on a roll here, so you continue.
Okay, all right. I want to take a look at some theological issues that, according to Tomasino, our author of our book, and I do recommend that you get it. You can pick it up on Kindle, or you can pick it up in hard copy, although I think the hard copy is hard to get right now. So anyway, so what are some of the things that were happening? What were some of the changes? And again, I'm not sure that all these are correct, but I'd like to have us take a look at some of these. And one of those is a few weeks ago when I had our presentation on Bart Ehrman's book, Heaven and Hell. I mentioned to you that in the Old Testament, there's very little discussion of resurrection, if none at all. Even texts that we use in the used from the Old Testament, if you take a closer look at them, probably are not written as we would like to think that they were. But the resurrection was a new doctrine, by and large. And it's interesting that the resurrection is a doctrine that might, there's not a lot of agreement on this, but might have come from Zoroastrianism, which was the religion of Persia. When a person died in Zoroastrianism, well, first of all, let me back up even. There were two gods in Zoroastrianism, and one was a good god, the other was a bad god. They were both powerful. Zoroastrianism is probably the only true dualistic religion that we have. And so what would happen is the person would die in Zoroastrianism, and then they would be resurrected, and they would go to a big mount. And there they would be reunited with other loved ones. And eventually they'd be reunited with their bodies. And then they would go into judgment. Now this sounds a little bit like what we see in the Christian era. There was differences. We don't believe in two equal gods. And we can talk about that issue in a moment. But resurrection was a new topic. And I think part of this was coming out is how do we handle this issue of justice? What happens to those who are evil? What happens to those who are righteous? There must be some time of justice where the proper punishment or reward is meted out. And so our author indicates that this was a weakness in Jewish thinking. And so by being around the Persians, they evolved into a resurrection. Now, again, the Pharisees believed in a resurrection, the Sadducees didn't. And so not all accepted that, but resurrection was very important. As a matter of fact, now this is down in the Greek period, but in 2nd Maccabees, there's a strong emphasis on the resurrection of the dead and eternal rewards. There's also more interest in the supernatural phenomena like the appearance of angelic beings. The 2nd book of Maccabees tends more toward that, what would become the Pharisees' theology and Christian as well. And so that was a new doctrine which was not developed in the Old Testament, is that of resurrection. Remember, we saw that when a person died in the Old Testament, they went to Sheol, and that was it. Now, I'm just going to end the resurrection issue there because I think there's more of that when we come into the Greek period. Dualism was something that was new in dualism in the sense that there are two forces that are locked in battle with each other for the souls of humanity. Now, again, I mentioned that the Zoroastrians were truly dualistic. Of course, the Jews couldn't accept that there would be two equal gods. In Zoroastrianism, there was Ahura Mazda, he was the good god, and Angra Mainyu, the evil god. And so what was happening, before the exile, they've said, well, when they went into exile, they said, the reason we're in exile is because we've sinned, we've violated God's law. And then after they come out of exile or start to come out, there's still evil happening to them, and they're doing what they're supposed to do. And so why is that? And that is because they're saying that there are two forces locked in perpetual battle with each other for the souls of humanity. And so this is where it becomes an individualistic issue as well as a corporate matter in this whole things. And while we're talking about the dualism, I'd like to move to another area, and that is of angels and demons. And again, this was something very prevalent in Persian religions. If you're wondering what I'm doing is I have my notes on an iPad, and I'm going to those. Before the exile, there was mention of angels. Hebrew is malak, and the term means simply messenger. Most often angels appear in roughly human form, but they could look very impressive. Their main role in the Bible is to act as intermediaries between God and humanity. And we have about cherubim. We see this in Genesis 3. They often appear in ancient Near Eastern art as winged hybrid creature like sphinxes. In the Old Testament, these beings seldom interact with humanity. They frequently function as guardians. And then there were seraphim. They had 6 wings, and they serve in God's heavenly courts. They were hosts, the angelic warriors, armies of Israel, usually invisible to human eyes. And they were called sons of God, apparently angelic beings who could appear human. In this case, the word sons doesn't indicate parentage, but only association, a typical Hebrew construction. And so even during the intertestamental period, these angels now take on specific names. There's Uriel, in charge of eternity and trembling. Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Sariel, Gabriel. Now we've heard of Gabriel and Michael, but the others, Uriel, Gabriel, Raphael, we don't hear too much except as archangels. But Zoroastrianism, with its angelic hierarchy, also believed that there was a small cadre of angelic leaders. But unlike Enoch or Tobit, the Persians held that there were 7, but the Jews said there were 6. So the Jewish system may have been encouraged by Zoroastrian angelology, but it didn't simply copy the Persian beliefs. So if you have good angels, you have to have bad angels, and that's where demons start coming about. And we read about that in First Enoch. And some of these demons are the result of the union of the sons of gods with the human women, and they took them as wives in Genesis 6. And we are told that the angels were led by Semyaz, who was like the Greek Prometheus. So there's this whole pantheon of good angels and bad angels, and they were demons. Our author of our book says that the Jews were very careful about making sure that they were not there was not equality between the two, because they didn't feel that anyone should be equal to Yahweh. And so many feel that this is where the concept of the chief demon, the Satan, becomes into Jewish thinking. And so by the time we come to the 1st century, during the Christian era, that the devil is really a full-blown character. And if you think back into the Old Testament, we kind of read back into the Old Testament some of these things about the devil. They're not really there. Like in the book of Job, Satan is not a proper name, but he's the adversary. So that's another doctrine. But what about prophecy? And maybe I got too far on this one. And I found this kind of intriguing about prophecy, and that is, well, let me just back up. You look in the New Testament. Let's give you the one about in Bethlehem, where the babies are slain, and they hearken back to a text in the Old Testament, and they apply that text to the babies being slain in Jerusalem. But that is not what the original text was referring to. It was referring to something else entirely that was occurring at that time. And you can go through, and I think especially Matthew, it's constantly saying, and as the scripture says. And so there's this concept of a pesher, and that is that the text can be used more than one way and more than one time. And so, and I think there was some discussion of that in early Adventism as well, especially about Antiochus Epiphanes. And so that's kind of an interesting concept that we had in regards to going up through the Persian period, the dualism, resurrection, angels and demons, prophecy. And I mentioned apocalypticism, and that is that the reason that there is suffering, that there are these two forces, and that someday the forces of evil will be destroyed. And of course, that's what the disciples saw the role of Jesus as the Messiah to do that. And so I'm going to stop there at through the Persian period, and I'm going to throw it out for discussion. Again, I have found this intriguing. It's kind of putting some things together that linkage that I think is important. So at this time, I'm just going to, oh, Rodney, did you want to say something now or?
Yes, let me just take a couple of minutes. I want to go back and quickly clarify my role in this and my interest in this period, clarify some terms and some periods, and explain what I'm going to focus on in subsequent weeks. Look, my interest in this and how this all came about was a discussion in our little Zoom group about where I shared my journey in terms of my second time around with theology, Adventism, Protestantism, where I needed to have a much more rational understanding of God and the entire story. And I spent 2.5 years now into this journey, and I'm facing this so-called silent period, this gap that I felt that I had to go into and study before I got into the New Testament. And Marv Ponder actually used this expression. He said, "Oh, that would be the intertestamental period." I had never heard that expression before. Now I knew what this time frame was. This period of what appeared to be biblical inactivity that begged me researching what was going on in God's mind, or what was God doing at that time. And so I had already had to step out in my readings to explain other gaps of silence in the Bible. Why were the Hebrew people down in Egypt for 400 years, the same period of time or thereabouts? I had to read outside of the Bible to understand that. Why did God talk to Abraham when he did? I had to read outside the Bible to understand that. We get the Genesis account, and before we're out of Genesis, we're sliding and segueing into Exodus. The world is populated. There are kings, there are nations, people everywhere. How did this happen? I mean, the Hebrew story, the Hebrew library as it is, it wasn't part of their story. So again, I had to read outside of the Old Testament and the Hebrew narrative to understand that. When God says, "Don't have any other gods before me," I'm not going to get that from the Hebrew Bible. That's not what they address. So I profiled all the senior gods that were in Mesopotamia at the time, and just asked myself, is there any of these gods that I would want to worship? The answer is no. But understanding that mosaic that is Mesopotamia helps me understand who Yahweh was and why Yahweh did what he did and how this whole thing evolves. And without that, outside of the New Testament, the Old Testament reading, I would have never got that. So when we get into this period here, again, we're faced with a mosaic. But I want to define a couple of terms here. It's referred to as the 400 years of silence. It's close to 500 years or 500 years plus. And there's no standard definition among scholars as to what the start point and the end point is for this so-called silent period. I've come across 4 of them, and just quickly, there is, as Forrest has mentioned, the Second Temple period, which starts at the dedication of the Second Temple, which is 515 BC to 70 AD, which was the destruction under Rome of that temple. That's a 585-year period, and that's very, very commonly the start and end point for this period. And then there's another 500 years of silence that people or scholars talk about from Habakkuk to Matthew. That's 443 BC to AD 70, 513 years. Now the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, they use a different time period. They talk for the period from Malachi to John the Baptist. That's also over 500 years. And they call that the Deuterocanonical period. Now, the key thing that comes out of this, there's the other definition for intertestament period, but some scholars use, is from 334 BC, Alexander the Great, coming onto the scene, up to 5 BC, which is when Christ was born. So 4 different parameters that are used, or time periods that are used to define the intertestamental period. There's no standard, and we shouldn't care too much. It's just a scholarly approach. But we also need to understand that this gap is a Protestant gap. It's not a Hebrew gap. The Hebrews were busy. They were writing. They were doing their thing. The Roman Catholics and the Orthodox Church don't talk about a gap because they had the apocryphal writings and even had some of the pseudepigraphical work as well. So it's a Protestant expression. And that tells me that it is a function of the compilation of the Bible, the canonization of the Bible. And so we should not assume that other religions, other than Protestants, think of this as a time of inactivity, a time of silence. No. And we shouldn't really think about it as a time that God was silent. Oh, it's a function of how the Bible was compiled. And there's plenty of literature that was written in that time, but it wasn't canonized, and maybe it shouldn't have been. I'm not a scholarly enough to know that, but that's where my questioning gets into, and I have to do some more homework on that, and I'm hoping that my buddy Bernard Taylor and others will enlighten me on that. But I want you to understand in your approach that this is primarily a Protestant issue. Now, the other things that I think are very important as we look at this period, and I'm going to focus on the Hellenization of the area and the influences on Judaism, the Maccabean revolt, the Hasmonean or Hasmonean era, and also the influence of Rome on Judaism. That's where I'm going to come from in my sessions. But I want to just talk a little bit for a couple of minutes on how to approach studying and thinking about this particular period and what scholars advise. The best way information that I got, and I want to share that this has been one of the most exhilarating 2 or 3 weeks of my life, answers so many questions, and I'm just so stimulated by what I have read about this period from 8 or 10 different scholars that I've looked at, to this point. Their advice is to look at Judaism in this period as really as a series of moving streams. As Forrest said, the Hebrew nation, the Hebrew people were not monolithic. They might have been monotheistic in Jerusalem, but only in Jerusalem, not in the northern state of Israel. The Hebrew people disagreed widely on how to apply the law, and the law was being defined out of Jerusalem by the Yudaite, which became the Jews, the Jewish scribes. It's a very, very complex mosaic. So the scholars that I appreciated the most say, follow the streams and look at the currents within the stream during this 400 to 500 year period, and you will have a much better idea of Judaism in the first century of Israel, because you cannot get an understanding of Judaism at the time of Jesus by reading the Old Testament. It was written much longer before. So if you want to understand what it was like for Jesus to be a Jew and the Jewish world that he was born into and raised into, and the forces that were operating, you can't duck around this intertestament period. You have to read through this period to understand that. You will not get it from certainly the New Testament, and you won't get it from the Old Testament. It won't get you there. You will end up with an understanding of a Judaism that operated centuries before. And that's not where you want to be if you take a scholarly approach to this. I think the other thing that I would mention on this is when I thought about it in my own reflections, my simple analogy would be, imagine watching a Netflix series of a 5-part series on Netflix, and someone pulls series 3 or year 3. That's what's happening here. If you want to go back and see what series 3 was about in this whole Netflix drama that we call the Bible, the canon, go back and find that series 3 in some of the writings that appeared in this time. And the only book in the Bible that was written in this time completely was the book of Daniel. There are many other books that were finished in this time, and even many Jewish scholars say the Torah was still being completed in this period. Well, goodness me, this period was very, very active. This is when the scribes were active. And the scribes were not just interpreting the law, they were still writing the law. Why wouldn't you want to know about that? So That's where I get that information. That's why I'm so stimulated by it. So I think I'll just close off maybe with a couple of other thoughts, Forrest, if I've got time before we go to questionings. Is that there's a danger here for Christians such as ourselves here, and there's two cautions that I picked up that I just want to share with you that I think are important in our approach to thinking about written material literature at this particular time. And that is, it's very easy for Christians, and I know some of them, who feel that God and Jesus is done with the Judaic period. It's been denigrated, it's buried, it's over, it's the old covenant, it's finished, he's done with the people. We just need to focus on the New Testament. There's a new covenant, and the Christians are in fact now the chosen people. They're the preferred people. That kind of Christian elitism. You know, keep in mind that Jesus was born into a Jewish family, raised Jewish, schooled Jewish, his friends were Jewish, his followers were Jewish. And as some of these scholars say, it's really important to try and separate the followers of Jesus from post-Christian Christians, the Christians that followed from the gospel. That was, again, a different period of time. It's important to understand Jesus as a Jew. He was a rabbi. His whole environment was Jewish. What was that like for him? And remember that when Jesus died on the cross, Judaism didn't die on the cross. It was moving, and it still was moving. It was a dynamic environment. And we understand that as a snapshot in time. All text is written at a point in time. And if we don't understand that point in time, how the heck will we really understand it and appreciate it? And that's why I would encourage you to go back and read some of the material that comes out of that period. And people smarter than I will tell you why some of it's in the canon and some of it's not. But some of this information that Forrest was talking about, looks like it actually fitted at one point into some of the books of the Old Testament, and looks like redactions and reads like redactions from some of the Old Testament books. Other pieces of the Old Testament look like they were reinserted afterwards, because part of the writing culture at the time by the scribes was to write material and assign it to their saints and their heroes and backload it, put it into the mouths of people that had credibility, and it would increase their credibility. There's a lot of editing and compilation of things going on that it's very simple for us Christians, Latter-day Christians, to just kind of skim over this particular period. So the last thought I want to share with you is on that vein, is that a sentence or thought from Matthew Henry, which really got my attention. And that was, God created man in his image. Christians were quick to return the favor. We have created Jesus Christ in our image. It's very easy for us to think of Jesus as one of us. He has our theology. He has our worldview. We would welcome him at our table. He's very much like us. Beware, they say, of making Jesus into a mirror of ourselves. Jesus' world was about synagogues, rabbis, the Sabbath, Pharisees, demons, circumcision, resurrection, and some of the other things that Forrest mentioned. That is hardly us today. So I encourage you, after that little spiel, to go back and read some of this material, but read it through the eyes of a moving Judaism, and not as static as an Old Testament script of Judaism or something that you've acquired in latter-day Christianity. Okay, Forrest, I think I'm kind of done with my kind of setup on this.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you, Rodney.
Forrest, did you have something more to say? Because I'd like to jump in here too, and I'd like to get Bernard and Peter. Anybody else who wants to jump in before we turn it wide open, okay?
Yeah,
but let me back way up. Go ahead, Forrest.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to back way up, okay, and look at the big patterns, and so we sort of position ourselves. And the dates we're looking at are 538 BC, when Cyrus says rebuild the temple, and then 70 AD when the Romans crushed the temple, all right? So it's
Okay.
that period of time, 538 to 70 AD, and that's the period of the Second Temple. That's what we want to keep looking at. But let's back way up. Abraham moves from Ur of the Chaldees to what we call Palestine. He has a son with Hagar named Ishmael, thought to be the leader of the Muslims, allegedly. Then he has another son with Sarah, who is Isaac, thought to be the leaders of the Jewish people. So Isaac then and Rebekah have two sons. Jacob becomes the father of Israel. Esau becomes the father of the Edomites, okay? And then we follow down to Jacob. He has 12 sons with 4 women, his 2 wives and their 2 maidservants. And so now we have 12 sons, 12 tribes. They find themselves in Egypt, eventually, a long time in Egypt, centuries in Egypt, according to the story. And then they get back to Palestine. Then comes a period of judges, a rather chaotic period, but they are led by these judges. And that is followed by a kingdom in which there are 3 kings, right? The first one is Saul, the second one is David, and the third one is Solomon. After Solomon, the nation gets split up. So Rehoboam takes the northern 10 tribes, Jeroboam the southern 2 tribes. And then in time, the Assyrians, not all at once, but over time, the Assyrians wipe out the northern tribes, and then the Babylonians come in later and take care of the southern 2 tribes. Then what we start here having is the series, like waves coming onto the beach. Here come the Assyrians, and then here come the Babylonians, and then after the Babylonians, here come the Persians, and Cyrus the Persian says to rebuild the temple. Then after the Persians, you have the Greeks coming through. And then after Alexander the Great, things break down into 4 different regions. And then you get the poor people of that region caught between people in Egypt, people in Syria, going back and forth, and the Greeks trying to impose their views on the Jewish people. Finally, the Jewish people revolt, right? Boom, 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 boom. And the Maccabeans revolt, and then they create the Hasmonean dynasty. And after that, the Romans come in and eventually subdue everything. The Romans get tired of all of this commotion, and they crush it in 70 AD. So that's the long big picture. And we're looking at that period from between 538 BC and 70 AD, called the Second Temple era, because it's based on the temple that Cyrus caused to be rebuilt. Having said that, let me just make a couple of comments. We need to be careful about the genetic fallacy. That is, ideas are not to be judged from where they come. Ideas are to be judged on their own merit. Good ideas can come from bad people. Bad ideas can come from good people. So whether an idea came to us by way of the Zoroastrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Greeks, whatever, its origin doesn't determine its validity. Its inherent plausibility is what determines its viability. So we need to, it's really important to catch these historical linkages, but the origin of an idea doesn't tell us whether that idea is good or bad. That is, the origin of the idea by itself. Okay, so here we are, and we have these different things of literature coming up, and we will look at them in turn. So that's the big picture. Bernard, do you want to add, subtract, or correct anything I've said, or Rodney has said, or Forrest has said?
No, I'm not interested in being forming some sort of review of everything that has been said. I welcome their interest. Many years ago, I made the same sort of discovery and was excited and still am as they are. And it's a great period of time. I'd like to offer just a few clarifications, though, that I think will help give some parameters, because the main introduction of the Apocrypha takes us into the period of early Judaism. I think we'll all find it helpful to distinguish between the Israelite religion throughout the biblical period, the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, and Judaism is introduced in the Apocrypha, though not formally. There is really not much about it. It just sort of appears, and this has been I guess in a sense for academics, a matter of regret. I wish there was, we wish there were more details, but certainly as you have both spoken, you can't go from the Hebrew Bible to the Greek New Testament without, in any sort of linear fashion. I was confused in New Testament that I couldn't do that. And so when I had the opportunity, I grabbed it. We talk about Malachi to Matthew, and that is useful because that's the Bible that we use. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's from Chronicles through to the writings of Paul, because Paul had written before the Gospels were recorded. Or, as you said, taking the time rather than the writing, the time of John the Baptist. The intertestamental period reminds me of Inter-America. I remember Jim Cox telling a story of being in a class and there was a woman there who talked about the Inter-America. And the professor, who wasn't an Adventist but knew quite a bit about Adventists, said, "You must be Adventist. You're the only people in the world I know who talk about Inter-America, which is between the Americas rather than Central America." And out of that same religion comes the intertestamental period. And it can be described in several ways. First off, when the Apocrypha consciously thinks of a beginning in 1 Maccabees 1, it goes back to Alexander the Great. We instinctively go back to the return from captivity, but that was too much earlier, and it was Alexander who changed the course of history, and the Apocrypha recognizes that. 1 Maccabees recognized that. You mentioned the Second Temple period. The other way to describe it is Hellenistic Judaism. Now, these don't all overlap, but much of the time they share in common. So there's just some terminology I think that will help us to be able to keep our thinking clear. And Judaism developed there. There's an enormous amount of literature available from Judaism. In the New Testament period, just to give you another thing to think about is, as has been mentioned, Hebrew was not in very wide use. And for Christianity, their equivalent of our Old Testament was the Septuagint. It was to the Greek that they had to turn. They had no choice. Now, in the temple in Jerusalem, Hebrew was being maintained, but it was not the lingua franca of the time. And so we get cut off from our roots when we ignore the Septuagint. So welcome to the world of Septuagint studies.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, Bernard. That's very good.
Okay, let me see if I can summarize what I heard Bernard saying. I heard these three things. One, we need to distinguish the religion of Israel and the religion of Judaism. That's one message I got. Secondly, is that instead of talking about Malachi to Matthew, we ought to talk about Chronicles to Paul. That was helpful to me. The third one was that instead of going all the way back to Cyrus, like we've been doing, we ought to go back to Alexander the Great, because the people then were more attuned to Alexander's impact on the world than they were on Cyrus's. I think those were 3 points Bernard made. Is that right? Did I get those right?
Exactly.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, let's see. Does Peter, do you want to say anything about this? Peter, I think we need you to unmute yourself. Monty, can you unmute Peter for me, please? Just a second, Peter. We're not hearing you.
Oh, I see Peter.
There you go.
Yes, I'd like to say a few things. First of all, I'd like to mention that during this approximately 400 years, the Jews, they have to be careful about preserving their national identity.
I'm sorry, Peter, could you say that again? I didn't hear you. Say that again, please.
One important thing that happened during this period was that the Jews were fighting basically to preserve their national identity. Do you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Well, we know from Nehemiah and Ezra that the Jews had serious problems when they came back from the Babylonian captivity in rebuilding the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. And that happened, we have to understand that going a little bit back to 721 when the Assyrians came and conquered the kingdom of Judah in the north and took captive all the Jews, and they brought, as their policy was, colonies from other parts of the empire and colonized them on Judah, on the territory of former Judah. Now, Nehemiah and Ezra, they have serious problems with these colonies that are not very happy to see Jews building again a strong city and a temple and creating a new home for them in the territory that they were living. And also, the second important moment in their history was the 2 times siege of the Babylonian army of Jerusalem, and the fact that they took a lot of nobles and a lot of artisans, they took them to Babylon. And they returned after 70 years. Another fact that I like to mention was that apocryphal writings, they are considered even today sacred holy writings by the Catholic Church. And the Council of Trent confirmed that around 1545. And also Martin Luther, when he translated the Bible, he put separately these apocryphal books, but as it was mentioned, not as having the same authority with the other books of the Bible, but they could be used for instruction. And another quick thing that I can mention was that these apocryphal books were most of them discovered in 1945 of Nag Hammadi in Egypt.
Okay, so go ahead. I'm sorry, Peter.
Yeah, I will stop here.
Okay, so what I picked up was the issue of national identity. And then secondly, the importance of the Syrians first, and then the Babylonians captivity. And then thirdly, here about Martin Luther speaking well of the Apocrypha, but not endorsing it as scripture. And then finally, I missed my last point.
Most of these apocryphal books or writings were discovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi in Egypt.
Could you say just a word about the Nag Hammadi tablets for us, Peter?
Well, they were digging for some purpose there. They discovered these scrolls.
Okay.
David, could I just make a couple of comments here?
Sure.
Is that part of the interest in the increased interest in the Apocrypha ties to what Peter just said, but was really stimulated by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were hidden there by the people who were at the enclave of Masada, the Ascends people. When you look at those, there's something like 820 pieces of literature, and all the Bible, Old Testament books were represented there except one. The only one that's not represented there is the book of Esther. But there were complete copies, 5 copies of the book of Enoch. There were book of Jubilees. There's a lot of apocryphal books that were discovered there, which indicates that at that time, in the time of Christ, these were sacred, or if not sacred, valued readings by those people that were the separatists, even the extremists, the nationalists at that time. So there's a statement being made there, but I think that we'll get to that later on. I'll talk about that more, but the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls really did accelerate an interest in the Apocrypha as well, to tie to what Peter just said. But I just want to underscore something that you mentioned and give a couple of parameters on that. When Israel and Judah split, somewhere between 800 and 900 BC, Judah had 20 kings. Only, the Bible says, only 8 of those kings did anything good. Only 8 out of the 20 kings did anything good. Now, Israel had 19 kings, and none of them get a positive mention in the Bible. That's a huge chasm between Judah and Israel that had already taken place, and had taken place before Cyrus came along. Cyrus really didn't have an interest in the Israeli people. He gave them permission to go home, and he arranged for them to take their holy items back to install the temple. They were gathered together, but his interest didn't go much further than that, other than his deal was, don't be a nuisance, don't rebel. Yeah, go back and do what it is that you want to do. But I think the key thing is that there's a huge chasm already between the state of Israel, the northern tribes, what we call the 10 lost tribes, and the scribes, the Judahite scribes out of Jerusalem that had the power of the pen, that were doing the writing, and they were controlling the writing. But the people that were the Israelites, the nation of Israel, the Sumerians and those people, they only obeyed the Torah. They never accepted the Old Testament. In fact, they didn't even have a book to read. They didn't have scrolls to read. The Syrians backload a whole medley of tribes off the Iranian plateau, and the people were already intermarrying. They're multicultural, multinational. I think many of them became Palestinian. They became Lebanese. They became Syrian. Those people, that nation was already, according to the Judahite scribes, people from Judah they were a lost people. They were the lost tribes. So I'm just mentioning this to underscore the chasm between Judah and between Israel. And you can see that in Israel today. When you go and study or drive around Israel today, the difference between the Israelites, the people of Israel, and the people, the scribes, the traditionalists that live in around Jerusalem.
May I just add a few, just
yes.
a small thing?
Mm-hmm.
I consider the most important among apocryphal things, I consider first and second Maccabees, especially first Maccabees, because it's providing us historical information about this period. We have some historical information also from Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian, that is talking, is presenting a moment when Alexander the Great came to Palestine and was received by the high priests and the other Levites from the temple, and they were telling him about the book of Daniel, that he was the one that the book of Daniel is talking about. And basically, for us, historical importance, basically, first Maccabee will be the most important, I believe, in my view.
Okay, we need to turn, what difference does all of this make to me today? You know, after I go home from Sabbath school, I say, well, okay, now I got a clearer picture of the intertestamental period, but how's that going to make me a better person in the next week? We need to turn to that as soon as we can. But Forrest, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to thank Peter and Dr. Taylor for their comments. I just wanted to add to Rodney's comments about the 19 evil kings of Israel. Let's remember who wrote that history. It was the Judah kingdom that wrote that history. So I think we have to take a grain of salt regarding the northern kingdom. Archaeology seems to back up much more of the intertestamental period comments than the earlier years of the so-called kingdom, the three kings of Israel. Anyway, and the other is Cyrus the Great did this for many nations, not just the Jews. Let people go back to their own areas and worship their gods.
Well, thank you. I think this is all exceedingly rich, and I'd like now to turn to the practical implications of all this and ask you, so what? All right? So what? Sure, there is nothing to be scoffed at, not in the least, to becoming more knowledgeable about our own past. That's very, very important. But are there any themes? Are there any patterns? Are there any motifs in that material that might be encouraging to us today, might be inspiring us today, might be informative, in some way, be helpful to us? And I've got 2 or 3 things I'd like to suggest, see if anybody else. One thing I think this material tells us is that God is never silent.
Yes, yes.
It may appear to us that there are long periods of time when God is not speaking. Maybe that's because we're not listening. God is always communicating. That's one thought that comes to me. Another thought that comes to me is that there's a real danger in being too good. That is, the people were really anxious to correct their previous errors and not become wayward again, and therefore not go into captivity again. And that resulted in a kind of moral rigidity that we see condemned by Jesus. Now, we need to be careful. The Pharisees were really good people, and Jesus was taking aim at the best people. But still, there was a kind of rigidity that set in, and that, I think, can happen to us too. Thirdly, though, and this I think is the most controversial, sometimes God uses people of questionable moral character to accomplish good things. And I think Cyrus would be an example of that. This is what's so provocative, though. Some people, evangelical Christians today, say that Donald Trump is the Cyrus of our day. He has much to, there's much about Donald Trump, they would say, that's regrettable, but he is doing God's work with respect to his judge, the appointees he's making to the Supreme Court, to the positions he's taking on abortion and homosexuality and things like that. So is Donald Trump the Cyrus of our day? And a lot of evangelicals suggest that that is so. So those are some practical insights I think we get from this material, but what do you folk think? What's of practical value in all of this?
Yeah, David, I see George has got his hand up, and then LaDon.
George.
Yes. Well, this first, David, this the chat remains disabled. We have not been. I have not been anything to the chat. It just says chat disabled. And I really appreciate the presentation. I never gave much attention to this period. Never studied it at all. Was never encouraged in church to study it, of course. So I really appreciated the rich information that was presented this morning. I have a question for anyone. It's just, I was wondering, what information from the Apocrypha, if any, could in any way hurt Adventist theology, our doctrines? Is there anything that could hurt or could contradict or would not match Adventist doctrine? Something from that period, and this is probably one of the reasons we were never encouraged to study, read, or anything. Even in the School of Theology, where I spent 4 years in college, we never talked about the Apocrypha. And just today, I'm seeing that we should have done that. So that's the question. Is there anything that actually could hurt our doctrine?
I would like to at least be one person that has a shot at that, George, because that really is an important question. And some of the 10 or so scholars that I've read on this so far, there's 2 of them have said they don't know anybody that have forsaken their religion and their beliefs, their Protestant beliefs, based upon reading the Apocrypha. Now, it is true that, again, I understand that it's true that the New Testament writers never cited the Apocrypha. They were aware of it, but they never used it in recital or as a reference. And yet, we learned through, in fact, this Sabbath school, that Ellen White cited an Apocryphal book in every book that she published. It helps explain her expansive knowledge. But to my knowledge, and from my own experience, is I feel enriched by readings to date over the last year or so that I have read pieces. It comes down to your capability to handle information. Most of the people on this Sabbath school, on this core, are scholars. They're intellectual people. We know how to handle information and sort information. To me, the vulnerability here of people is people who are confused in their theology, who don't deal with information very well, who don't sort very well. They may be misled. So that's pretty much how I see it. But that's why I, at the beginning, talked about how do you approach information. You always, before you're reading new material, have to have some points of reference out there as to how you're going to approach it and how you're going to deal with it. If you just dive into it, you can go anywhere. So pause and understand what you're looking for and what you'll expose yourself to and how you're going to deal with that information. Have a framework for it.
You know, I respond to that too. There was a recent article in Adventist Today about the Apocrypha and Ellen White and some of the early Adventists, actually probably the beginning of the 20th century, and how well it was used. So I'm not sure if I could answer, is there anything that would harm Adventism, but at least selective passages seem to support the Adventist perspective. And I think it was Ron Graybill one time said that one of the books, I think it was Second Esdras, was very important in early Adventism. So we have gotten away from it for various reasons, but at least our forebears were using the Apocrypha. By the way, I've got Don on there. George, did we answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right, and I got LaDon, I got Karen, and I know Yoli. I've got you after that, so.
Okay, just a quick
Okay.
note. Bernard has says that Enoch is not in the Apocrypha, or First Enoch is not in the Apocrypha. Okay, we get that done. And Monty has opened up the chat, so you can chat if you want to.
Thank
LaDon,
you.
Forrest?
LaDon.
Thank you. I'm Persian. So talking about Cyrus and stuff, please don't compare. I have to say that. Don't compare our president to Cyrus. He was, please, just don't. And today being 4th of July, I remember coming to this country and hearing that this is the greatest nation. We have the greatest nation. We have the greatest. And I think there is this culture of American exceptionalism, and I think all cultures have this. But Zoroastrians were very interesting people. Their religion was very interesting, and there still are practitioners of Zoroastrianism. And you know, Persians were sometimes good and sometimes were not that good to Israel. Sometimes they persecuted Jews and sometimes they didn't. Some dynasties persecuted, some dynasties thrived. We actually have Ashkanians who were Christians. They were Armenians who ruled over Iran. They were Christian nation. So I think in American culture, you don't get much about other cultures and their histories. And so what you have here the last 200 years is the greatest. Well, I'm sorry. Cyrus was a very interesting person to let all the slaves, that all the people they had been conquered, to go back where they came from. He did not enslave them. He respected their culture. He let them stay. He gave them regions they could build and they could worship as they wanted, and they could interact. My parents were Jews who were in Iran, in the city of Ekbatan. How many thousands of years they had stayed and they had lived. So please, no. Americans are great, but they were great nations, and people thrived, people invented, people lived, people were bad, people were good. Sorry. No comparison. It will boil a lot of blood.
Thank you. You know, it's quite remarkable that your family probably goes back to the Jewish people who lived way back then.
They are from
way back in the time of Cyrus.
They are from the city of Esther Mordecai. They are there, from their city.
My, that's remarkable.
Well, certainly on a relative basis, Judaism, the Hebrew people did well under Cyrus and the Persian realm.
They stayed. Some of them stayed. Some
That's
of them
right.
went back.
A lot of, most of them, the literature I've read is they went back in small groups. But Ladain is right. Many of them stayed, and many of them went to other quarters. Egypt, Forrest was right. The biggest Jewish population thereafter was in Egypt, not in Palestine. You know, so there were enclaves forming, and we'll get more into that later. But Dan is right on a relative basis. He was a liberator. Cyrus was a liberator for the Hebrew people, and he left them alone to do what they wanted to do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I get to Karen, and then I'll get to Yoli? Karen?
Thank you. I want to thank everyone who participated in the presentation so far. It has been very rich and enlightening, and I've enjoyed it. And the very idea of taking up this topic for the next several weeks, I'm very much looking forward to it. I wanted to speak to your question, David, about what difference this class might make in my real life this week and say that I, along with many people, have really struggled with Jesus. And it's hard to say, but I don't find him attractive or relatable at all. And so I find it much easier to have a relationship directly with God. And I tend to spend most of my devotional time in the Old Testament. And so I have an expectation, and I've realized it to some extent just from the presentation so far today, of humanizing Jesus a little bit. And I anticipate very much getting to know him as a real person through this discussion, which I would not have guessed that this would have been the avenue to make that discovery. So I'm very grateful. And
there you go. Thank you so much. I
Karen.
don't feel alone about how should I say it? We have devolved to a Unitarianism of the second person of the Godhead, so that the only one we talk about anymore is Jesus. And I think that we need to keep in mind that Jesus came to reveal the Father, and that's the important point. It's the Father, and Jesus brings us to the Father. So I don't want you to feel alone on that.
thank you.
Okay, we have Yoli. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute, Karen, did you want to say more?
No, thank you.
Yoli, go ahead.
Thank you. Maybe 13 years ago, I studied the Maccabees with Pastor Larry Christopher, wonderful teacher. And I became very interested in those two, mainly those two. And from my understanding, there were Jewish texts of Hellenistic origin in Judaism after the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century. Many of those texts were incorporated in the Catholic canon. What I don't understand is exactly when these texts were deemed not inspired, not worthy of the Hebrew Bible. Another question I have, mostly to Dr. Taylor, if please, is how do we respond to Revelation 22 verses 18 and 19 with regards to taking and adding scriptures as they fit our agenda or our understanding?
I'll take it.
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of Revelation, we have made a great deal of that. I know that there are, I say Adventists because that's where my life has been spent, but many Adventists will not write anything in their Bible because they feel that that would be adding something to it. What I hear from those verses is let the text stand in its own right. And since you open up about the Apocrypha, Jerome was invited by Pope Damasus to make a translation because there were lots of local translations. We called them the Old Latin. They had favorite passages they had translated, and so there was no one standard text. There were a whole lot. And Jerome was uniquely qualified to do this. His native language was Latin, but he was fluent in Greek. And then when he moved to Bethlehem, he had a Jewish convert to Christianity teaching Hebrew, and his translation in the Old Testament was mostly from the Hebrew. There is a translation of the Psalms from the Septuagint. Jerome himself only translated 2 of the books of the Apocrypha, Judith and Tobit, and I expect we'll come somewhere closer to that than we are at the moment. But all of those books were included there. And as far as Judaism was concerned, they had their own principles and established the canon. But the important thing to keep in mind is it was Christianity largely who preserved the Septuagint, because that was the Old Testament available. That was the only available Old Testament until Jerome's Vulgate. And the term has been used deuterocanonical. It means second, not secondary. In the Catholic Church, both are equally important. So first of all, Jerome did not translate all the Septuagint, all of the Apocrypha into Latin, only 2 books, which was a place marker, the significance of which was taken up much later. And Luther did not support the Vulgate, as you have heard, and it was in the 18th century when the Bible societies in 1611, when the King James Version translation was made. Once the Old Testament and Old Testament and New Testament had been translated, the King James had another committee formed to translate the Apocrypha, and from the beginning, the King James Version included the Apocrypha, which leaves one remaining question: where did it go? Why is it not in our Bibles? And when in the 18th century, the Bible societies were formed, they decided under some pressure, and not least from North America, not to include the Apocrypha anymore. And that is what we have inherited. And now we find it difficult to go back and read it, when at the time of Jesus, it was part of the Bible that was there. And there are numerous New Testament quotes, as you have heard. But an element arose that, as perhaps separation from the Catholic Church, decided that it would not be included. And it was the 1989 publication of New Revised Standard Version that brought the Apocrypha front and central in a Protestant Bible. Now,
I think he muted himself.
I'm sorry.
Say the word.
And off the space bar. So the English Standard Version from Crossways was published by Oxford, and it included the Apocrypha, and I was one of the 3 translators of that. But to respect the conservatism of Crossways, the Apocrypha was published in the back of the Bible to indicate that this was secondary, but it is available there. But at the Society of Biblical Literature, this has never been sold. Crossways has never sold it. And in fact, the people selling there didn't know it existed.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Say that again about that. Is it Crossways? Is that the language you use?
Yeah, no, Crossways is just the name of the publisher. It was published by Crossways, which is a very well-respected publishing company, but very conservative. And so it wasn't included. And so Oxford obtained permission to take the text and to add the Apocrypha to it. And there were 3 of us who did that.
Wow.
Good for you, Bernard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think.
Forrest, can I just add a couple?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I want to pick up on a couple of things that were takeaways, David, that you mentioned. I really appreciate you mentioning that God is never silent. Humans in their managing documents and compiling things might have created gaps, but I agree with you. One of the big takeaways for me is God is never silent. The second one would be, I don't see any point in God sending another prophet. It was done. There were plenty of prophets. It wasn't going to turn things. Another prophet's not going to turn things around. I think the next thing really as a takeaway would be the power of the written word, the book, having a book. Gets to the Septuagint. We'll get more into that. But the power of having the Septuagint and how that got into the hands of people and getting away from the model, the ceremonial model of the temple and replacing it with synagogues was a huge movement. And we'll get more into that. That was a critical movement for Judaism and obviously Christianity. And the last one is kind of a cute point, but I became aware reading through here is asking a question is, what did Jesus read before he went to sleep? The realization is probably a book that we've never heard of.
Okay.
Or possibly, not probably, possibly a book we haven't heard of.
Yeah. I think we have Dr. Boskovic. Did you want to say something?
I'm sorry, the conversation has drifted away from a topic. Perhaps another time.
I feel badly when we don't get to hear from Danilo.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, it just occurred to me that when I see people speaking about something being very great or themselves being very great, that is actually evidence of smallness. People who are great make other people around them greater. If I have an impact on others that enables them to be more of what they can be, then I have made a positive contribution. If I make other people around me feel smaller, then I'm not great. I'm just a small person because I make everybody else smaller too.
Well, I'm glad we didn't miss that.
Thank you. Thank you. Karen, did you want to speak again or you didn't move your hand down?
This may be mundane, and I would ask Dr. Taylor or anyone else really, and I'm a little embarrassed that I have to ask, when did I miss this? When and how were these specific texts? Why do we talk about the Apocrypha? Because some of them, as I think Rodney mentioned, are kind of pulled out of other books. Why is this set of texts separated out and called the Apocrypha? Did I miss that?
I'm not, there's been there's been different tracts. The Hebrews, or the Jews never included these books in their canon. The Hebrew-speaking Jews, but the Greek-speaking Jews did include the Apocrypha in their canon. And so Christianity has had it, and Roman Catholicism kept it, and then Protestantism, or Luther, didn't like it, but then it got back in again. So Karen, I'm not sure.
Karen.
And I do know that when I worked for the American Bible Society, that there was some discussion about it, but it's hard to make pocket Bibles with the Apocrypha in it. So I think that was more of a financial thing.
Apparently, it's hard to make pocket Bibles with the Old Testament in it. They're hard.
Well, that's true too. But anyway, so it's been back and forth. So anyway, Roger, do you have your hand up?
If I may just respond to that, Forrest, I think I think in my part of my presentation, I really didn't speak specifically about the Apocrypha, but there's this question of authorship of the Apocrypha. But there's this area that we'll get into in subsequent weeks here called the pseudepigraphia, which are extra writings that are out there. And so the authorship issue comes up with those. And as Bernard pointed out, that, for example, the book of Enoch, it's not an apocryphal book, and yet in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it's incorporated in there with the book of Jubilees. You see, so you do have these moving parts out there, or the assembly of literature that has been somewhat selected. But in terms of comments that I've made in that area of the Apocrypha, which I didn't get into really, but I did allude to the authorship of writings, apocryphal writings, and these pseudepigraphia. It's a debate among scholars as to where did that material come from and who really authored it.
Thank you.
And so it makes it kind of, as the scholars that I've read, they say it's interesting to read. It is useful to read in terms of lifestyle. It's relational, but they're not saying that it is sacred. That gets into the issue of the canonization of the Bible, which I know nothing about. I'm curious. I need to learn about that myself.
All right. Thank you.
I don't see any other hands up, David. Is there someone else? Just wave your hand and, oh, okay, Peter. Unmute yourself.
Just a second, Peter, we're not hearing you.
You have to call your expert on that, Peter, to help you.
There we go.
Thank you, very generous. David raised an interesting question, and of course, this can help, can serve us as a conclusion of our discussion. If I remember correctly, you asked what the Jews learn from this period and expressing their apocryphal writings. And if it's also something important for us to learn from this. And also George raised the question if these apocryphal writings are coming in contradiction with our beliefs, one or more beliefs. The first question, I say yes, the Jews learn something from their period of captivity. They express that in their apocryphal writings. And what they learned was that they should not repeat the mistakes of the past, and their greatest mistake was idolatry. And we don't hear anything about idolatry in the Jewish history after their return from the Babylonian captivity. To me, they learned very well this lesson, that this should something that they should not do. And in regard to George's question, yes, I think we can find some things that are not in accordance with the Adventist beliefs. And one thing that comes to my mind, if I remember correctly, I read the apocryphal writings a long time ago, but I think in the second Maccabee, it's the idea of immortality of the soul. And as we know very well, immortality of the soul, it's a Greek idea. It's a Platonic, Neoplatonic idea. And this comes in contradiction with what we believe.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
I have a question.
Oh, John, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, you're silent now, John.
This doesn't have to do with the Apocrypha, but early on when you were talking about Israel in its early years, you said that there was more than one God that they worshiped. And I kind of had a feeling that maybe it was the king or someone who might be doing that. But did the average Jewish household have like little idols or something that they prayed to?
My hunch is they did. this was, monotheism really didn't come out until after, I mean, strongly until the time of Josiah, and then really confirmed after the exile. But we do know that the Jews were worshiping the high places, and they were Baal there, Ashtoreth, Moloch.
What was the appeal of Baal or Moloch or those? I'm just curious. I think you're on this.
Well, they had good parties a lot of times. So you got, you know, you go to a party sometimes, at least I did when I was in university, not because you accepted everything, but, you know, there was good food and drink there. So, but I do think Moloch was considered a very powerful god. And, you know, most people were not well trained. So that's what I would say.
Well, John, to me, that gets back into the bigger picture of the mosaic that was Mesopotamia. Remember that Yahweh, if it was Yahweh, didn't speak to Abraham until around 2000 BC. That's when the time of Abraham. Then there wasn't much going on. He made the promise and the contract with this Semitic dynasty of Abraham. But he talked to Moses about 1500 BC. There were nations around the world then. They're all through Mesopotamia. There were nations who had their gods. And initially, and the people fought the wars for their high priests and their gods. The average little farmer trying to subsist on the Euphrates River and feed his family, did he really have a hatred for the Israelites way down in Jerusalem? This is a much more complex picture that gets into issues of divinity, but it gets into the issues of God. So when Yahweh says, I don't want any other gods before me, we have to say, who were they? And there are a bunch of senior gods that operated in Mesopotamia that we as Adventists and Christians are encouraged not to study because they're pagan gods. But they were Yahweh's competition. To think of it in terms of a chessboard, that's how I think of it. They were there and they were real. And in fact, most of the northern nation of Israel who didn't fulfill their commitment, their contract with Yahweh. There's only the two tribes in the south that did in the end, the tribe of Judah, and I guess it was Simeon, and maybe a few people from the tribe of Benjamin, which they got the land to the north of Israel, and Saul was a Benjaminite. So, but the rest of them were kind of scattered, and they didn't have a Bible. And all through there, archaeologists have found shrines, and many of them in Jewish settlements, shrines to Baal. They were confused who Yahweh, the God, was. And even you go about 35, 40 miles out from the city of Jerusalem, and there's shrines there to Baal and to Asheroth, and they found shrines to Yahweh, the God of the Jews, and Asheroth. Some of those people didn't know that he wasn't married or didn't have a female escort. There's a lot of confusion. And my takeaway is the whole model that was one God, one temple, and one people didn't work. One God monotheism worked really well, but one temple didn't work. And that's why the synagogues and the whole ceremonial model kind of broke down. And the one people didn't work, and that's where we get the New Testament and the Septuagint and the use of that, whatever. This is all theological development. But we have to understand there were competing gods in Mesopotamia that we are somewhat shepherded from because they are pagan, and it's not nice to study them.
Okay. Well, thanks, Forrest, and thanks, Rodney.
If I could comment on that too, it's true that maybe they like to party, but you know, a lot of these religions have a cycle of nature, and one of the perhaps disappointing parts about biblical religion is that it is less attuned to the rhythm of nature. The specific events in the history of salvation become more important than the natural cycle of the seasons. And the natural religions are, their fertility rites are not just orgies. They're participating in the natural rhythm of the whole cosmos. And it's biblical religion sometimes struggles with that. Now, I think that The Bible has a lot more to say about nature than we sometimes have been told in recent years. But there is this sense that we should align our lives with the way the world is working in general, and that has a lot of appeal. The other thing these religions were pretty good at is trying to influence the gods to favor them in terms of prosperity and health and so forth. So these gods had they had a coarse appeal, but they also had a much more subtle appeal that we ought not to be dismissive about, I would think.
Okay,
Rodney, Forrest.
I've got two more here. I've got Danilo and then George. So,
Hey, George, Forrest, I have something to say too.
Daniel, we need you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm going to go.
For raising this question.
Yeah.
I was always puzzled why throughout the Old Testament, Israel and Judah later perpetually had this problem of lapsing into idolatry. Why is that? What's going on? I mean, they had a God who literally brought water out of a rock. He gave them manna on a daily basis, and he helped them vanquish all their enemies. What's the problem with that? You know, in fact, in the Old Testament, there are several places where God is lamenting. He says, is there another nation who changed their gods? But my people changed their gods. How is that? Well, I was thinking about this. It occurred to me that today we do not worship idols, but we are in danger of worshiping ideologies. And ideologies are like forms of, how should I say, aberrant, abortive forms of religion. They're a problem because they enable us to put everything into a smaller box and call that truth. Perhaps idolatry was serving the same purpose. We as human beings have always loved to simplify things. Just give me a simple story that I don't have to think about. And that will be that. God is so big, and I want something small, something I can manage. Perhaps that's the reason why we are always tempted to lapse into some form of, shall we say, turning our back on God, who He is, and on truth for what it really is, and wanting it in a package that will suit our particular tastes. And that's how we end up with idolatry or ideology.
Okay, I have Bud, and then I'm going to go to George.
I would just thank Rodney for his statements with regards to thou shalt have only one God before you. I grew up as an Adventist and went to church school through undergraduate school, and always was told early on that the commandment that says thou shalt have no other gods before you had to do with a belief or a feeling that you like, for example, recess better than God, you like the car better than God, the house, the property better than God. But I think, recently, and then what you've said today supports the idea that there were so many, many gods, the multiplicity of gods. That was a statement by God that you should have no other gods before you. so that comes to mind, perhaps rather elementary. But the other thing is, I'm beginning to hear more and more about controversy or discussion about Trinitarianism. And I think the people who don't support the Trinitarian theology would use that commandment as well. I suspect that's a whole nother topic, David and Forrest. But thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bud. I have George.
Yeah, I'm muting here. Yeah, very quickly, because I understand the time is gone. Are the Jews considered monotheists today? And second, are we Adventists considering ourselves, or do we consider ourselves monotheists as well? Don't laugh. Don't laugh.
Well, of course, Jewish people would. The Jewish people would say they're monotheists.
Always.
Of course, we're monotheists. Of course. Now, some people devolve our monotheism into tritheism, but that is a mistake. We are monotheists. There's only one God, and that God we experience as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But there's just one God. So we need to be careful. I think popular religion often devolves the idea of Trinity to tritheism, which is a mistake. So yes, we are monotheists, but sometimes we forget about it.
Okay, I've got Yoli. Go ahead.
Are we monotheists? How are we believe in one God when our God has three heads? We have a balkanized God. And I am afraid. I love God and I respect God. So I'd never say, I always pray to God and thank him for presenting Jesus to us as a conduit to him. But I never pray expecting Jesus to answer, to do things for me. I always pray to God because I'm afraid of God and I respect God and I love God. So when you say Adventists only have one God, and then follow it by saying the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that bothers me because Jesus said, why do you call me God, Father? Only the Father is God, such and such. It's very confusing.
We need to have a seminar on the Trinity. If more and more people use the word triune rather than Trinity, the one triune God, I think that is clearer. But since the idea of the triune God is under some pressure from some quarters in Adventism these days, we probably ought to have a few weeks on that.
Yeah, if I could just make a kind of a comment on that without a determination on it, but I understand the frustration. I have a number of Jewish friends who point out that we Christians have a counting problem right out of the gate. Christianity's got a counting problem. We've got this dance, theological dance that we dance around the 1, 2, and 3, the 3-step they call it. Islamists call it the 3-step too, the Christian 3-step. And there's lots of ways that we talk. Well, maybe more. There's lots of ways that we talk about it, but it's probably a discussion for another day. But I just forget the point that I was going to make actually about monotheism, but that can wait for another. That can wait for another day. It has to wait for another day. Just gone out of my brain.
Can I comment on that? This is McKinley.
Yeah. Oh, McKinley.
I've been quiet because I've been enjoying the dialogue, but couldn't help make a comment on this question and the challenge of the Trinity. I used to have a challenge with that too, until I heard somebody use the example of an egg. An egg has the shell, the abdomen, and then the yolk. We never talk about 3 eggs. We only talk about the egg. So that example sort of helped clarify the idea of one God, one triune God. in my experience. I don't know if that helps, but that's the example I like to mention.
In any case, we don't worship a three-headed God. That's there's just one God, Yoli. Just one
So
God.
we worship an egg.
No,
No, not an egg. We
But
worship
that-
one God.
we're looking for analogies, and the egg is a good analogy, but we develop this language because we experience God in several different ways. But we just have to be clear about this. We are monotheists, and insofar as we've sort of drifted into tritheism, we've made a mistake. And if one looks at Adventist history, if anything, we were overly monotheistic in our Arian views early on, not wanting to affirm the full deity of Jesus. So, yes, let's not have any question about that. We can count, Rodney. We can count to one, and that's as far as we need to count.
Well, let's remember that there were several church councils that debated this in some wars, and I'm not sure.
I think it's interesting to talk to Christians and ask them who do they pray to. And I've got a number of friends who pray to Jesus and in the name of Jesus because that's their identifier. They don't know who God is. It's when Jesus was asked about the Father, he says he's like me. Don't worry about it. It was a step around kind of answer. Don't focus on that. Just kind of focus on me. But they only pray to Jesus. They don't speak to God. But like you, and myself, the other people will pray to God. We don't pray to Jesus. That's an interesting phenomenon that occurs within Adventism. But if you ask Adventists, is when they pray the Lord's Prayer, our Father which art in heaven. Who is our Father? Adventists tend to go all over the place in my experience. So we won't solve this today, David, but I'm just pointing out like there's this interesting.
Oh yeah, we solved it already. We solved it already. There's just one God. There needs to be no. I often ask this question. You folk have heard me ask it before. If you were going to have God home for Sabbath dinner, how many plates would you put down? 1, 2, or 3? And the answer is 1. You just have 1. You don't have 2. You don't have 3. We need. There are some things about which we need to be really, really clear, and we can say anything else we want to say about God, but that God is one is something we cannot budge on. Okay, is it time for? Go ahead.
Rodney, the verse you mentioned about Jesus saying, "When you see me, you see God." It's like if I send my lawyer to court, he represents me. I have so much trust in him. I put everything in his hand. He represents me. So when he's standing there as me, but he's not me.
Okay, so
I think that's a reasonable answer. That's a reasonable answer.
Could I add a bit here? It turns out that our brains are made up of some 100 billion neurons. And when we say my brain, which of those neurons owns the rest? Which one of them is the greatest? We have a trouble thinking in terms of unity. This is a problem. When Christ was praying, he was saying, I pray that they, the disciples, may be one as you and I are one. How is this an issue?
Well, okay. We went from the Apocrypha to the Trinity. This has been a great day. We will continue next week. Now, we're going to call on others of you to present, and let's keep this simple. We have a textbook, and if one were willing, one could do this much. One could pick out representative paragraphs from that chapter and share with us those paragraphs. One doesn't have to make a big PowerPoint presentation like Forrest did today, which was wonderful, but if one looked at that chapter and said, okay, I think here are 10 paragraphs that are worth sharing with the group as a whole, And if you send those to me, I can get them up on the screen if you don't want to do so. So this is something that any of us could do to get the conversation started. And once it's started, as you could see today, it can go in very rich directions. Okay, any other comments before we call it quits?
I'm going to
Thank you to
say
everybody for their comments.
Thank you.
yeah, next week,
Yes.
Rodney's going to get into the Hellenistic period, and we'll be pressing into the
Okay.
next chapter. So,
Yeah,
Or
thank
are you going to do the
everyone.
Persian?
Thank you
Are you-
everyone for the comments. And David,
Yes.
get 2 extra plates. Get 2 extra plates. Just in
Enough
case,
way.
you know. Just in case.
3 personas, huh? 3 personas.
Sorry for throwing that question in. It generated a little bit of
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good question because we just need to keep hammering away at it. We just worship one God.
Yeah.
That's it. We just have to keep saying that again and again and again. All right, let's pray. Dear one God, we are thankful for all the blessings of life, and we are mindful that in every moment of every life you are working for good. Help us to be sensitive to that leading in each person's life, we pray. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
We'll see you in a week.
Thank you.
Thank you.